You open your eyes to breath so cold it stings your nose. Your blanket is stiff with frost. The fire has gone out. It went out sometime in the night, or maybe before that, you're not sure. There's no glass on the window, only cloth and a bit of waxed paper. And beyond it, snow, grey, relentless, quiet. It's June. Outside, the trees are still bare. The chickens haven't laid in weeks. The last of the salted meat was eaten 3 days ago, and your father's boots cracked when he tried to fetch water this morning. No one remembers warmth. Not really. For your grandmother, this is just how winters are. For your mother, it's a season of stillness and silence. For you, it's the only kind of summer you've ever known. This is not the Ice Age with mammoths and glaciers. This is the Little Ice Age. It crept in slow, stayed for centuries, and reshaped everything without a sound. And tonight, we'll go back there. Gently, quietly, to a world held together by smoke, snow, and survival. The cold is not new. It has been with you for days, weeks, perhaps months now. But this morning, it feels heavier. You wake before dawn because the cold will not let you sleep. It has seeped into the straw beneath your back, into the thin wool blanket, into your fingertips. You keep them tucked beneath your arms for warmth, but the warmth is almost gone. Beside you, your younger brother breathes in short, shallow bursts. His nose is red, and you wonder if he'll cough again today. There is no fire. It went out sometime in the night. You heard it crackle once, maybe around midnight. Then silence. The hearth now holds only ash, and 2 unburned ends of charred pine, cold as stone. You sit up slowly, careful not to wake the others. Your breath leaves your mouth in little puffs that hang in the air before dissolving into nothing. The single window at the back of the room is covered in a thin layer of ice. Not frost ice, a grey sheen that blocks the view but lets in light, pale and sickly. Outside, snow rests in thick, uneven drifts. The path to the barn is buried again. You helped shovel it just 2 days ago, but it does not matter. It never matters. The snow returns overnight, as it always does. It is June. You try to remember what summer felt like. You cannot. You dress in silence. The same shirt you wore yesterday and the day before. It still smells of wood smoke and old sweat. Your trousers are stiff from the damp. The boots are cracked, the left one tied with twine. The wool socks do little. Your toes are cold within minutes. In the kitchen, your mother is already awake. She stands over the iron pot, stirring slowly. Her hands are red, raw, wrapped in thin cloth. She nods at you but says nothing. Speaking costs breath, breath costs heat. Breakfast is a thin porridge, ground barley with bits of last year's dried carrot. It is warm, which is enough. There is no meat today. There hasn't been meat for 5 days. The salted pork ran out after the last storm. There will be no more until the trap lines offer something, or until someone is desperate enough to trade. The house smells of smoke and boiled grain and damp wood. The walls are not insulated. The roof leaks when the snow melts, which is rare. The floors creak, and the corners hold the cold like a basin. Your father returns from outside, stomping snow from his boots. His face is tight. He carries nothing. No eggs, no milk. The cow is dry. The hens have stopped laying. One froze last week, standing in the coop. Its eyes were open. You eat in silence. The children do not ask questions anymore. Even the baby is quiet now. He cries only when the chill reaches his chest, which it often does. After the meal, you are sent to gather kindling. The path to the tree line is short but treacherous. The snow is uneven. Beneath it, the ground is frozen hard. Your breath comes fast, each gasp burning your throat. Your fingers go numb, even beneath the mittens. You do not stop. If you stop, they will sting. Then they will stop stinging. That is when the real danger begins. You gather branches. Most are damp, some are frozen solid. You scrape bark from the sides with a dull knife, hoping to find dry wood beneath. Your boots fill with snow, your cheeks ache, but the silence is deep out here, heavy, comforting, in a strange way. Back home, the fire is rebuilt. Your brother fans the embers while your mother feeds in twigs. Smoke curls upward lazily, then faster. The room warms by a degree or two. You sit close, hands extended, but you feel little. The day passes slowly. There is no school. The teacher stopped coming 3 weeks ago when the drifts reached his windowsill. No one has heard from the next village since February. The road is impassable. Some say wolves took to sleeping on the trail at night, listening for footsteps. You mend a fishing net. Your sister cards wool. Your father sharpens the axe. Every task is quiet, every movement deliberate. There is no wasted effort, no wasted food, no wasted words. Outside, the snow continues. The sky remains grey. You think you saw the sun this morning, but you are not sure. It has been days. At supper, you eat boiled turnip. It is soft, tasteless. You chew slowly, staring at the wall. Your mother hums a song you do not know. Your brother begins to cry, softly. No one speaks. He is not scolded. The baby coughs once, then falls asleep. Night falls early. You gather around the fire, what little flame there is. Your father tells a story, not a funny one, but a real one, about his grandfather walking across a frozen river to trade for salt. It took 2 days. He lost 3 toes. Your father smiles faintly when he says it. No one laughs. You sleep in the same clothes. The blanket is shared. Your sister's feet press into your shins. Your brother's hand is curled beneath your neck. The wind howls outside. The shutters rattle. You think of the stream down the hill. It hasn't flowed since January. You wonder if it ever will again. And as your eyes close, you try to remember what summer smells like. You cannot. Not anymore. He was not a scientist in the modern sense. He had no lab coat, no equations scribbled on a chalkboard, and no titles granted by universities. But he observed, he recorded, and he endured. And in that quiet endurance, he left behind one of the most detailed pictures we have of what cold truly meant, day by day, year by year. His name was Reverend William Derham. An English clergyman born in the 17th century, Derham lived in a world already gripped by the Little Ice Age. But unlike many who suffered it in silence, he wrote, almost obsessively. Every morning, he measured the temperature. Every afternoon, he noted the direction of the wind. He described the frost on windows, the crunch of soil beneath boots, the speed of thaw in a particular field behind his church. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because the world around him was changing, and he, like so many others, was trying to understand why. He used a thermometer designed by Daniel Fahrenheit, an invention still new in his time, fragile, uncertain, filled with mercury and doubt. Derham kept it by the church wall, shielded from wind but exposed to truth. He called it My Glass. His notes were meticulous. Frost began on the 9th of October, harder on the 10th, he wrote. On the 12th, all the ponds frozen by morning. Elsewhere, the Thames froze at London Bridge, but broke 3 days later, flooding the stalls. He did not dramatize. He did not speculate. He simply recorded. The wind blew from the northeast. The sheep stayed huddled against the stone fence. The ink in his pen thickened on colder days. His handwriting wavered slightly in winter, as though his fingers stiffened from within the glove. Derham's journals cover years, decades, and in them you can feel the slow rhythm of survival, how communities learned to predict hard winters by the way the birds flew in August, or how early frost on brambles meant a barren orchard the next spring. You can sense the exhaustion in his lines, too. Another week of grey, no warmth in the morning. Parishioners have stopped attending before sunrise, or later. The snow has fallen every day since Christmas. Bread stores low, requests for coal increasing. But Derham's writings were not only about weather, they were about people. He recorded funerals more frequently in winter. He noted when elderly neighbours stopped appearing at market. He described a boy found curled in a barn, wrapped in his mother's apron. He named him Thomas, then never mentioned him again. What he left behind was not just data. It was a human archive of cold. A record not just of how low the mercury dipped, but of how people bent beneath it, how the cold changed behaviour, shaped ritual, silenced villages. We think of history as grand events, kings and battles and revolutions, but Derham's history is different. It's quiet, it's repetitive, it's about the long, slow weight of climate on ordinary days. He died in 1735, at the age of 74. In his final year he wrote less. The cold was particularly harsh that winter. His last entries are brief. Frost again, no thaw, lambs lost, and then nothing. His journals were kept in the church for a time, passed from hand to hand, forgotten, rediscovered. Now they sit in archives, their pages brown and curling, but still legible, still cold. Through his eyes, we see the Little Ice Age, not as a single event, but as a presence, not a storm, but a season that never quite ended, a breath on the window pane, a silence in the church pews. He did not fight the cold, he did not curse it, he simply met it, day after day, with ink and patience. And thanks to that quiet ritual, we remember a world where cold was not a nuisance, it was the shape of life itself. It begins with a rumour. Someone claims they saw ice from bank to bank. Another says they walked halfway across without hearing a crack. By morning it spreads through alleyways and bakeries and over walls. The Thames has frozen again. London awakens slowly in the dark months. The sun, when it shows itself, does so late and low. But on days like this, when the river stops moving, something ancient stirs in the hearts of the people. The frost fair is coming. The Thames, broad and slow, is not easily tamed. In warmer times it carries ships and traders, refuse and memories. But in the heart of the Little Ice Age, when winter grips harder than it has in generations, the river stills. Not often, not predictably, but when it does, it becomes something else entirely. The city watches first. They test it. A dog is sent across, then a child, then a man with too little to lose. When all return safely, the vendors arrive. Tents are pitched directly on the ice. Fires are lit in iron pans, low to the ground, their heat just enough to warm hands, not enough to crack the surface. Barrels of ale are rolled onto the floes. Pies are stacked high. A printer sets up a small table and begins pressing souvenir broadsheets, printed on the Thames, January 1684. People come in droves. They skate, if they have blades. If not, they slip and laugh and hold hands. Musicians play fiddles that sound slightly out of tune in the cold. Children are pulled along in sleds made from wooden crates. Couples walk slowly, wrapped in scarves, their breath curling into the air between them. There are games, tossing the kettle, sliding contests, dancing in boots that barely grip. A man brings a bear on a chain, real or not, no one asks. Someone sells gingerbread in the shape of the Queen. It is not extravagant, but it is extraordinary. For a few days, the frozen river becomes a world of its own, strange, temporary, and oddly joyful. The cold has forced the city inward for so long that this sudden openness feels like a kind of rebellion, a refusal to let winter have everything. But it does not last. The ice begins to shift after the second day. Small cracks appear near the piers. A kettle disappears into a hole during a game. The printer packs up quickly. The food vendors linger, then follow. Parents tug at their children's hands. Their voice is more urgent now. And then, one night, the thaw comes. Not all at once, but enough. The river groans deep, low, and wet. The stalls are gone by morning, the footprints melt, the games vanish. By afternoon, the ice breaks completely, and the Thames begins to move again, carrying bits of wood and paper and an abandoned glove. By the end of the week, there is no sign anything happened at all. But for those who were there, the frost fair lives on, in memory, in the stories told by firelight, in the fading ink of a broadside printed on ice. And it happens again. Not every year, not even every decade, but when the cold is just right, and the wind comes from the east and the sky turns that particular shade of grey, people look to the river, and they wait. Because in the deepest cold, when the city should be silent, something stirs beneath the snow. A laugh, a song, a spark. And the frozen river remembers. To be cold is to be aware of the body. It is a sensation that ignores thought, bypasses reason, and settles deep into the bones. It reminds you, constantly, that you are alive, and that staying that way requires effort. But what if you did not have to try? Not everyone in the Little Ice Age suffered equally. While villagers and farmers patched shoes with twine and slept beside dying embers, another world existed just beyond the forest, up the hill, past the gates. A world of thick stone walls, layered furs, and roaring fireplaces the size of small cottages. To be wealthy in the 17th or 18th century was not simply to have gold. It was to have distance from discomfort, and in an age when winter stretched across half the year and the sky hung heavy for months, that distance could feel like a form of magic. Let us walk, slowly, through the halls of such a place. The estate sits on a rise, looking down over fields now blanketed in snow. The approach is lined with bare trees, their branches dusted white. Inside, the air smells not of cold, but of wax and wood polish. Fires burn in nearly every room, tended not by the family, but by servants who rise before dawn to strike flint and carry ash. The flames are steady, confident, fueled by hardwood stacked high in sheds behind the kitchens. In the drawing room, carpets stretch across the stone floor, layered thick to trap warmth. Heavy drapes hang at the windows, drawn shut before dusk to keep in heat. Candles flicker in silver sconces. A decanter of warmed, spiced wine waits on a tray. The lady of the house reclines in a chair of carved oak, wrapped in a robe lined with fox fur. She reads by the fire, a blanket across her knees. The book is French, and the pages are thick and crisp. Her dog, small and well-fed, dozes on a cushion near her feet. Upstairs, her children practice their lessons. The tutor wears gloves, but the children do not. They are young, their blood quick. The fire in the schoolroom is modest, but steady. A globe sits near the window. A chalkboard leans against the wall. Outside, the snow falls softly against the panes, but inside, the world is orderly, calm, and warm. The master of the house walks the halls in a coat of wool and velvet. He visits the steward to discuss the coal deliveries. He checks the kitchen's inventory. He does not touch the snow except when necessary. His boots are cleaned before and after every outing. When he ventures out to the town, he rides in a coach lined with furs, warmed by bricks heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth. Meals are served hot, not one, but several courses. Bread warmed near the hearth, meat roasted on turning spits, puddings boiled in copper pots. The kitchen is a world of its own, filled with motion, smoke, and heat. The scullery maids wipe sweat from their brows even in January. But it is not only fire that keeps them warm. There are layers. Clothing is crafted with care. Linen against the skin, then wool, then heavier outer garments. Gloves lined with lambskin, stockings thick and high, cloaks with fur collars. Even nightclothes are layered flannel shifts, then nightgowns, then heavy blankets piled atop feather beds. And the beds themselves, they are not simple places. A wealthy household's bed is a structure, raised from the floor to avoid drafts. surrounded by curtains to trap warmth. Blankets, quilts, sheets, and bolsters, all designed to create a bubble of heat, a small sanctuary in the long night. They do not shiver in the dark, not often. Yet the cold finds its ways in. The windows rattle, the hallways remain chilly, pipes freeze despite the steward's vigilance. Sometimes a guest complains of frost on the inside of their chamber's window. Servants carry coals in brass pans to warm the sheets before their masters retire. Still, it is manageable. Still, it is comfort, relatively speaking. But wealth does more than warm the skin. It also insulates the mind. The elite write about the cold, but they do not dwell in it. They speak of winter in poetry, in metaphor. The snow is beautiful from behind the glass. The fire crackles pleasantly. Ice on the fountain makes for a charming view. The discomfort of others is far away, muffled by doors and distance. Letters are written, "It has snowed again. The garden looks lovely." Or, "We dined by the fire last evening. The wine was excellent." They do not mention the cottagers down the lane whose roof collapsed beneath the weight of snow, or the child who was found frozen near the mill, or the parish poor who burn old furniture just to keep from stiffening in their sleep. Not because they are cruel, but because they are buffered, removed. And so, winter becomes part of the ritual, part of the landscape, an aesthetic. When the frost fair comes to London, they attend briefly, wrapped in the finest furs, gloved to the elbow, stepping carefully between tents. They smile, they buy a printed broadside, they return to their coaches. The ice beneath their feet is a novelty, not a threat. They do not ask what happens when the thaw begins. Downstairs, the servants live a different winter. The kitchens may be hot, but the servant quarters are not. The fires do not reach there. The walls are thin, the floors cold, the ceilings low. In the attic, where the younger maids sleep, the frost creeps in along the beams. They sleep in shifts, sometimes two to a bed. They rotate to stay close to warmth. One rises to begin the fire before the other leaves the blanket. They are not beaten, not here, but their world is colder, harder, and less forgiving. A housemaid rises at 4 to draw water. The pump is frozen again. She breaks the ice in the basin with her knuckles, then carries the pail inside. Her hands are raw before the sun rises. She does not complain. There is no one to listen. The butler checks the coal bins. He sends a boy to restock the cellar. The boy slips on the steps, bruises his hip, and is given a cloth soaked in cold water for the swelling. No fire is wasted on bruises. Still, it is better than the village, better than the almshouse, better than the frostbitten farms beyond the forest, where families sleep beside livestock for warmth. The estate is a world within a world. It hums, it burns, it resists. And because of that resistance, the cold seems distant, manageable. The lady hosts guests for tea. The drawing room is filled with murmurs, laughter, and the occasional piano note. Outside, snow piles against the windowsills. Inside, a maid quietly adds another log to the fire, careful not to disturb the conversation. There is talk of politics, of books, of a cousin's engagement. No one mentions the labourers who cleared the road that morning, their fingers bleeding through split gloves. No one speaks of the apothecary's line, how it now stretches down the alley with coughing men and pale-faced mothers. That is not the sort of thing discussed over tea. The wealthy can choose what to see, what to feel, even in the dead of winter. But the cold does not care about wealth. Not entirely. When the freeze lasts longer than expected, and the coal deliveries are delayed, even the manor feels it. When the storm blocks the road for 10 days and the pantry begins to empty, a shadow falls across the tapestries. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. The master writes to the steward, "We must make the supplies last." The lady shortens the dinner courses. The children wear thicker stockings. A guest is snowed in for a week. He sleeps in the red chamber and remarks on the draught. The footmen bring him an extra quilt. Still, they wait and wait. And when the thaw finally comes, the relief is quiet but unmistakable. The road is passable again. Coal arrives. Apples from the cellar are baked into pies. The guests depart. The tapestries are cleaned. But something remains. A knowledge, a reminder. That warmth is not guaranteed. That even behind thick walls and velvet curtains, the world outside is vast and white and patient. The lady resumes her reading. The fire crackles. The snow begins to melt. A footman opens the parlour window for the first time in weeks. The air is damp, but no longer sharp. Somewhere, a bird calls thin and uncertain, but real, and for a moment the world feels new. Even here, even in luxury, even after the cold, in town, winter lingers differently. Among the merchant class and the rising bourgeoisie, comfort is an aspiration, not yet a certainty. Some have hearths in multiple rooms, servants to tend fires, imported coal from Newcastle. Others warm stones in the oven and wrap them in cloth before placing them under bedsheets. A few make do with body heat and faith in thicker curtains. The middling sort live between two winters, one of closeness to wealth and one of memory when their fathers still carried buckets of slush from leaking roofs. They invest in insulation, line their coats with rabbit fur, join winter societies where parlours are shared and tea flows freely. They read news of frozen canals in Amsterdam, of frost fairs in London, of entire vineyards failing in France, and they know it could still reach them, harder next time. In the cities, the elite escape the worst of it by virtue of proximity. Proximity to fire, to money, to power, to warmth. But in the countryside, among the gentry and landed aristocracy, their estates become small kingdoms of heat, islands in a frozen sea. Still, these islands depend on trade. When the barge routes freeze, spices run low. When the drifts block the main roads, no new linen arrives from the mill. There is grumbling over tea when the sugar is gone. When candles must be used sparingly, the inconvenience is never mortal, but it is real. And even in great halls lit by dozens of flames, there are moments when cold reminds them it does not recognize rank. One night, the fire in the great hall goes out. The wind had shifted. A downdraft smothered the embers. The room, vast and ornate, quickly chills. A party of guests, dressed in finery, gathers their shawls tighter. A footman rushes to relight the flame. Another brings in kindling. A lady coughs lightly, and two heads turn in concern. The fire returns. Slowly, the warmth creeps back into the drapes. The wine is refilled. The moment passes, but the silence lingers for a while longer. Later that week, a horse is found frozen in the stable. The boy assigned to feed it had overslept, his blanket soaked from a leak in the ceiling. The animal is buried behind the orchard, and no one speaks of it again. Seasons continue, spring returns, grass pushes through thawed earth, the orchard blooms cautiously. By midsummer, the memory of cold begins to fade, but not completely. The firewood is ordered early now. The windows are checked for gaps. A new stove is installed in the east wing. The pantry shelves are stocked higher than before. Salted meat, dried beans, flour sealed in tins. And the servants, fewer than last year due to illness and cost, are reminded of their duties well ahead of the frost. Because even here, even in rooms adorned with gilt and velvet, the fear of winter endures quietly beneath the surface. It shows in the way the steward touches the pipes, checking their temperature in September, in the way the mistress lays out the blankets in October, though no one has yet complained of chill, in the way the dogs are brought inside earlier than usual. The cold does not rule these homes, but it is remembered, it is respected, it is prepared for. The wealthy do not escape the little ice age. They weather it, layer by layer, log by log, coin by coin. And in their journals, their paintings, their letters, they leave behind a picture not only of resilience but of isolation. For while the hearths burn brightly, and the wine is mulled with cloves and cinnamon, beyond the window panes lies a world that freezes just the same, a world they may never touch, but one that always presses against the glass. There is nothing so quiet as a dead field. Not a fallow one, not a field resting, preparing for the next season, but one that should have grown, one that was ploughed, planted, prayed over, one that gave promise, then withdrew it. A field that betrayed. The little ice age did not arrive as a single storm or one failed season. It crept in, whispering through early frosts and late springs. It arrived in the form of hailstones in June, rains that never stopped, and wines that cracked seedlings at the root. For the peasant, this betrayal of the soil was not abstract. It was immediate, personal. You plant in hope, you wait in faith, you harvest in necessity, and when that harvest fails, there is nowhere to hide. The winters grew longer first. In some places, the snow came in October and stayed until April. By the time the soil thawed, there was barely time to turn it before the rains began. Crops need a rhythm. They need warmth at the right hour, sun at the right angle, and ground that isn't ice 2 inches down. But the rhythm was gone. Grain suffered most. Wheat, the great provider of bread, failed often. Either the spring was too late and the seed never took root, or the summer was too short and the heads did not fill. Barley fared slightly better, but even it bent under the weight of cold rain. Rye survived where nothing else could, but it fed with a bitter taste and rumours of illness. And when the grain failed, so did everything else. Bread prices soared. In some cities, a loaf that cost a penny in May would cost 4 by August. There were riots in market squares. Bakers were accused of hoarding. In France, a woman was trampled to death in a flour line. In Germany, carts were overturned and looted. But hunger begins before the market. It begins in the field, with stalks too short to bind, with kernels shriveled in the husk, and it begins in the heart. The farmer walks the rows with hands behind his back. He does not speak. He counts the heads with his eyes. He does not bother to bend down. He knows what he sees. The ground is too wet, or too dry, or too cold. Always something. In the highlands of Scotland, sheep starved because the grass never returned after the thaw. In Denmark, herring catches dropped so low that entire villages relocated inland. In Poland, the forest swallowed abandoned farms. Apples froze on trees in midsummer. Vineyards withered on slopes once thought sacred to the sun. Even bees died in their hives, confused by the shifting seasons. The people did what they could. They planted fast crops, turnips, cabbage, buckwheat, things that might ripen in time if the summer gave them even 6 good weeks. They dug deeper root cellars. They saved seeds with more care than coin. They ate less, always less. Families culled their animals early. Better to slaughter in August and salt what little meat remained than watch it starve come January. Children were sent to gather moss, bark, anything fibrous enough to boil down. A soup of weeds and dried beans became a feast. And still the hunger came. It showed in the cheekbones first, in the way men began to loosen their belts, not out of satisfaction but necessity, in the way women stopped bleeding, in the way children stopped growing, and it brought disease. Hunger weakens the body's lines of defense. Fevers took hold faster, coughs lasted longer, wounds festered where once they would have healed. Small infections bloomed into death. In the Netherlands, chroniclers noted entire households that vanished between spring and winter. In rural England, parish registers listed infants as unbaptized stillborn, not always because they were, but because no priest could reach them in time. The poor suffered first. But famine does not ask about wealth forever. In the year 1693, France suffered one of its worst harvests in centuries. The rains came hard and did not leave. Grain sprouted mould, fields flooded. By December, over 1 million people had died of hunger and its companions. One noble wrote, "My tenants no longer pay rent, for they have nothing. I forgive their debts, but cannot eat their gratitude. Churches stayed full, people praying, hoping, bargaining. But prayers do not warm soil. They do not coax roots to take hold in frozen ground. By spring, those who remained began again, because they had no choice. It wasn't just the plants that failed. The weather twisted everything. In years when the ground thawed early and seeds went in with hope, frost would return abruptly and with malice. A single night in June could undo months of labor. Farmers awoke to white fields and silence, their dreams blackened overnight. Hail came next, stones as hard as bone, clattering from the sky, breaking stems and bruising fruit before it could ripen. One traveller in Bavaria wrote of fields beaten flat as if by soldiers' boots. In Spain, oranges fell green and hard to the ground. In southern Italy, figs never matured. The olive groves were struck not by storm, but by stillness, the air too cold for bees to fly, and without pollination, the trees bore nothing. And so people adapted, or tried to. In the alpine regions, they shifted to grazing, but when the pastures failed, they turned to herding goats higher and higher up the slopes. Even the animals grew thin. Bones became common in waste piles, goats, pigs, sometimes dogs. In Norway, fishing villages pulled less from the sea. The herring shifted routes, the cod grew sluggish. Ice crept farther south along the coast, and boats could not launch from frozen harbours. Men died not just of drowning, but of frostbite, hands locked to oars, lips black by morning. Still they tried. Still they planted. In some places the calendar became a lie. Spring was no longer March. It was whenever the snow melted, sometimes not until May. Autumn could arrive in August. One year, in Bohemia, snow fell in midsummer and did not leave for 17 days. Gardens became shrines of desperation. In small villages, old women bent over rows of turnips, whispering prayers into the earth. Seeds were blessed. Rainwater was saved. Children were taught to weed with reverence, because even weeds had value now. Entire communities shared tools, shared seed, shared hunger. And yet, there were years when nothing helped. The 1742nd were cruel across much of Europe. Known as the Great Famine of Ireland, the devastation wasn't caused by potatoes that would come a century later, but by rye and oats, which failed repeatedly under erratic weather. Rivers froze, then flooded. Towns were cut off. In one county, burial grounds overflowed, and bodies were interred in common pits without markers. And still they planted, because what else could they do? The church bells rang, not for weddings or feast days, but for funerals and fasts. The priest gave sermons about endurance, about Job, about manna from heaven. But the people needed flour, not parables. Still, they listened, and when the frost came again, they wrapped the tools in cloth and waited. In Asia, too, the Little Ice Age took its toll. In parts of China, the Yellow River froze in ways never seen before. Crops along its banks failed under deep frost. Famines spread through the Qing Empire, and officials struggled to respond. Granaries emptied. Rebels rose in places where food did not return. In Japan, the Tenmei famine of the 1782nd, driven in part by volcanic activity, but worsened by cold, killed nearly 1 million. Rice failed, silk production faltered. Families sold daughters to brothels to afford millet. And still the pattern repeated. Hope, planting, watching, praying, failing, starting again. Every year, a gamble. Every season, a memory. It is said that hunger teaches quickly, but in the Little Ice Age it taught slowly, brutally, and always it came with silence. There are not many songs about starvation. There are no plays. Just empty bellies, empty barns, and graves dug shallow into frost. Yet even in that silence there was persistence. A mother boiling nettles while her children watched in silence. A father walking 20 miles to barter a carving for flour. A village coming together to share a cow slaughtered early because the winter was coming hard, and every spring they went back to the fields. They dug with stiff fingers, they sowed seeds too precious to count, and they waited, again, for the earth to remember them. Some years brought small relief. A decent summer here, a dry autumn there, enough grain to fill the church storehouse, enough meat to dry and hang from the rafters, enough apples to press for cider. These were remembered like birthdays. The year of the long harvest, someone would say, or the good rye year. But even then, the shadow of hunger never quite left. Families stored food with a kind of reverence. A loaf of bread was not merely a meal, it was a symbol of having endured, of having outlasted another winter. Children were taught not to waste. Crumbs were swept into bowls, crusts were dried for broth, and always they planted again, not out of confidence, but because the alternative was worse. Famine carved itself into folklore. It shaped prayers and proverbs. In the German countryside, old women whispered, "Don't trust the green too early." In Scandinavia, a rhyme warned, "A mild May makes a false friend." Even in France, peasants said, "The sun can lie," and the sun often did. Entire villages would prepare for planting, lured by a string of warm days, only to lose the entire crop to a frost that returned like an insult. In England, the saying, "Ne'er cast a clout till May be out," was less advice and more survival tactic. Food was political too. In the cities, grain became a weapon. Authorities controlled the price of bread to avoid uprisings, even when it meant bankrupting millers. In Paris, during a particularly lean season, a baker was hanged for hoarding flour, though later it was revealed his supply had been stolen days before. No one much cared. Someone had to pay. In Russia, Tsars issued decrees regulating rye quotas. In the Ottoman Empire, granaries were fortified like fortresses. In Sweden, merchants were sometimes compelled to release their private stores under threat of seizure. And in all these places, beneath all these laws, were the farmers, still planting, still hoping. They began to breed hardier varieties, rye that could survive a colder soil, turnips that grew faster, barley that needed less light. They rotated crops with new precision, even when the earth seemed to laugh at their efforts. And slowly, painfully, some learned how to survive, not to thrive. That would not come until much later, until climate warmed, until new crops arrived from distant lands, until modern agriculture reshaped the very meaning of soil and seed. But in the heart of the Little Ice Age, survival was the victory. A root cellar that stayed full until March, a calf that lived through the snow, a harvest just large enough that no one died in the village that year. Small triumphs, but real ones, and they mattered. They shaped the generations that came after. Even today, in some rural communities, old planting rituals persist, lighting candles near seeds, turning the soil on certain days, observing the moon, not because people fear famine as their ancestors did, but because the memory lingers in the blood. The land remembers, the wind that once came too early, the sun that failed to warm, the frost that curled leaves like fingers. And in that memory is a quiet kind of reverence, because the Little Ice Age was not only a time of suffering, it was a time of waiting. Waiting for the thaw, waiting for the sprout, waiting for one good year. And somehow, despite everything, those years came. Not often, but enough. Enough to keep planting, enough to keep going, enough to keep believing that, even after the worst cold, the earth might forgive. A city is not just stone and soot. It breathes, it shifts, it remembers. And in the grip of the Little Ice Age, it froze. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough that the streets of Amsterdam cracked under weight they hadn't known in centuries. Enough that in Paris, the Seine turned still, and ice bloomed at the arches of bridges. Enough that in Prague, watchmen struck their boots against the cobblestones every few minutes just to keep sensation in their toes. Cold changes everything, and nowhere does it change more than in a city. In the countryside, there is space to retreat, space to burn wood, to move livestock, to wait. But in the city, winter arrives like a siege, tight streets, close walls, no room to run, and too many mouths to feed. Take London, for example. The capital teetered on the edge of frost and fire. During particularly brutal winters, the Thames slowed, then stopped. And when it did, life above it exploded into something surreal. Frost fairs, vendors, even puppet shows staged in the middle of the frozen river. But these were brief, bizarre celebrations built on a desperate truth. The city had to pretend the cold was a festival, because otherwise it was a threat, because cities suffer differently. A frozen street in the countryside may be empty. A frozen street in a city is still crowded, still noisy, still pressed on all sides by human need. The poor froze first. In tenements with cracked windows and ceilings that wept with condensation, families huddled together under shared rags. The fireplaces, if they worked at all, were little more than holes in brick that let in more wind than heat. Chimneys clogged with soot, rats chewed through floorboards. The air inside was colder than breath. Charcoal sellers worked overtime. Street children, barefoot in January, offered to shine shoes that had no shine. Women lined up outside the bakeries not just for bread, but for the ambient warmth of the ovens. Some swept streets just to keep their blood moving. Others never rose from their blankets again. The middle class insulated. Those with some coin bought extra coal, thicker drapes, and candles by the dozen. They hosted smaller gatherings, closer to the hearth. Rooms were partitioned to conserve warmth. They wrote more letters because walking to deliver a message became too risky. Entire parlours became makeshift bedrooms to keep families near the one reliable fire. And the elite? They watched from behind fogged windows, sipping hot chocolate and grumbling about the price of oranges. But even their homes strained. Roofs collapsed under snow weight. Pipes froze and cracked. The water pump seized. Coal deliveries were delayed by frozen roads, and no amount of wealth could melt ice when the sky offered nothing but silence. Markets shrank. Vendors sold what they could: salted fish, wilted greens, barrels of grain that had once been flour. In Venice, canals froze solid enough that food shipments from the mainland had to be dragged across on makeshift sleds. In Krakow, the main square stood empty as traders stayed home, unwilling to lose fingers to profit. Church bells rang slower in the cold. The metal contracted. The ropes stiffened. Even sound seemed to move reluctantly. But the city carried on, because it had to. In Constantinople, scribes kept records even when ink froze in the inkwells. In Edinburgh, students attended classes wrapped in blankets and professors lectured with gloved hands. In Hamburg, men delivered beer through tunnels dug into the snowbanks, and it arrived frozen. Life adjusted, reluctantly. Street lamps were lit earlier, not because the sun fell faster, but because the shadows deepened in winter's stillness. Inns became sanctuaries, their doors open late, their floors packed with those who could afford a warm night. In Prague, chimney sweeps were revered like physicians. In Copenhagen, city officials met in underground chambers to avoid the sting of above-ground winds. In Moscow, the snow was not a visitor, it was a king. In Moscow, the snow ruled like a monarch. Drifts swallowed the first floors of buildings. The streets became corridors of white, and roofs disappeared under weight. Chimneys poked through like desperate fingers, and smoke curled upward with a stubborn slowness, barely escaping the press of cold air. But even in this, the city found rhythm. Snow clearing became a daily act of survival. Prisoners and peasants alike were conscripted to carve pathways. Guards were posted not to prevent crime, but to ensure no one froze silently in a doorway. In the Kremlin, Wood was rationed. The Tsar himself wore furs indoors. Palaces echoed with the sound of boots on frozen stone and the quiet complaints of servants whose fingers cracked beneath velvet gloves. Everywhere, the city transformed. Architecture shifted. Homes were rebuilt with thicker walls, steeper roofs to shed snow, deeper cellars to store food against extended winters. Fireplaces grew larger, chimneys multiplied. Streets narrowed to hold in warmth. Windows shrank, or were doubled with oiled cloth. Even the city's pace changed. In the warmer months, urban life was movement markets, horses, cries of vendors, music. But in winter, everything slowed. The carts were fewer, the wheels wrapped in cloth. Animals were moved underground or into shared courtyards. People walked less, spoke less, saw each other only in passing through steam and scarves. Art changed too. Paintings from the era depict a strange stillness. Town squares empty, streets buried, skaters moving alone on wide rivers. A man with a lantern lighting a path through snow so deep it climbs halfway up a statue's pedestal. In these works, even joy is muted. Writers documented not just the frost, but the atmosphere. In letters from Florence, it was said, "The marble breathes cold. In Amsterdam, I open the shutters each morning to find the world gone again. In Leipzig, silence has a new weight, one that presses on the chest." But the cold was more than poetic. It was invasive. The poor lived with it. The rich hid from it. The city adapted around it. Hospitals filled with the frostbitten, not from expeditions or mountain climbs, but from walking home after work, from standing too long in a line for bread. Fingers blackened in gloves, toes froze in boots. Children fell asleep near cracks in the wall and did not wake up. Firewood became currency. In parts of Germany, taxes were accepted in bundles of kindling. In Poland, dowries included carts of coal. In London, landlords accepted chopped logs as partial rent. And theft of firewood was treated as a serious crime, sometimes punishable by flogging, sometimes by death. People burned what they could: furniture, books, family heirlooms. In one tragic account from Vienna, a widow burned the cradle that had once held her child, just to keep her and her elderly father alive one more night. And still the snow came. Still the frost pressed its face against the glass. Yet amid the hardship, innovation sparked. In Lyon, tanners began lining shoes with animal fat to insulate the leather. In Geneva, window makers experimented with double glazing. In Stockholm, a priest wrote a manual for insulating homes using straw, dung, and tar, a work that would be copied dozens of times across Scandinavia. The city became a laboratory of adaptation, not for comfort, but for survival. And in doing so, it learned to wear the cold like a second skin. The citizens changed too. They moved differently, thought differently, trusted less in luck and more in preparation. A new awareness settled over city life, a constant low hum of vigilance. Would the baker's oven hold through the month? Would the chimney draw tonight? Would the road to the next town open before the stores ran out? Cold made the city honest, and it made the people wary. But it also made them enduring. By the 1702nd, cities across Europe had begun to live with the cold as though it were a fact of architecture, like walls, like streets. It was a constant presence, always to be worked around. Public bathhouses adjusted their hours less for hygiene, more for heat. Libraries kept their doors open not just for minds, but for bodies. In parts of France, bakers became unofficial guardians of the block, allowing neighbours to warm their hands by the ovens during early morning hours. Some cities formalised these habits. In Vienna, winter kitchens were built for the poor soup houses, where broth and bread were served at no cost. In Warsaw, guards were posted not just to catch thieves, but to knock on shutters where no smoke rose from chimneys. In Amsterdam, floating barges were converted into mobile stoves that drifted along frozen canals, selling hot chestnuts and tea. The city, in all its crowded contradiction, began to act like a body, pulling warmth inward, circulating it, conserving energy. And just like a body, it bore scars. Even as winters passed, the memory of cold lingered in the alleys. People hesitated before planting flowers in late April. City councils budgeted for firewood every year, even during milder decades. Children were told stories of past freezes, not to scare, but to instruct, always be ready. In art and literature, the cold remained. Novels described silent courtyards in January, where even footsteps sounded hesitant. Paintings lingered on the glow of windows against snow-packed roofs. Music slowed in tempo, as if mimicking the frost. The Little Ice Age had imprinted itself on culture not through epic tales of battle or conquest, but through quiet detail, a cracked pipe, a muffled cough, a line for bread, a hand pressed to a frozen pane. And then, slowly, the cold began to recede. Not everywhere, not all at once, but it began. By the late 19th century, the worst winters were behind. The canals froze less often, the frost fairs stopped, the rivers returned to water, and with them, the cities exhaled slowly, cautiously. New technologies emerged: gas lighting, central heating, rail transport that could bring coal in days instead of weeks. Refrigeration turned cold from an enemy into a tool. The very idea of winter changed, becoming a season instead of a sentence. But the memory remained. In older neighborhoods, window shutters still close against winds that no longer bite as hard. Cellars hold coal bins long emptied. Doors remain doubled. And in attics, tucked between beams, are old quilts no one quite dares throw away. Because the city remembers. It remembers the winters when breath turned to ice before it left your mouth, when water froze in cups left beside the bed, when a hot potato passed hand to hand was a form of love. It remembers the songs sung not for joy, but to stay awake while walking home in snow so deep it touched the windowsills. It remembers the silence. And even now, when the heating hums and the frost stays mostly outside, that silence still waits. On rooftops, in alleys, in the space between footsteps on a quiet, snow-dusted morning, the city endured the Little Ice Age. And in doing so, it became something new, not simply a place to live, but a machine of warmth. A structure designed not just to shelter, but to fight back, against the cold, against hunger, against stillness. And in that resistance, in that breath turned visible in the early morning air, the city found its soul. The year was 1816. Across the world, people looked to the sky and saw something they could not name. The sun rose pale and cold, casting no warmth. The light came sideways, crops failed, birds vanished. Rivers stayed locked in ice long after they should have thawed. It snowed in June, and no one understood why. They called it the year without a summer. In New England, frost blackened cornfields in July. In Switzerland, lakes froze over in August. In China, rice failed 3 seasons in a row, and in India, the monsoon never came. But this was not just a strange winter. It was the echo of a distant catastrophe, a volcanic eruption halfway around the world, powerful enough to shift the weather of an entire planet. Mount Tambora, in April 1815, on the island of Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia, the mountain exploded, not erupted, exploded. With a force 10 times greater than Mount Vesuvius, it tore its peak apart and sent more than 150 cubic kilometers of ash and debris into the sky. The sound was heard over 2,000 kilometers away. For days, darkness cloaked the region. Ash fell like rain. Entire villages disappeared. Tens of thousands died instantly. But Tambora's most devastating legacy wasn't in what it destroyed, it was in what it unleashed into the sky. The eruption sent sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere, where it formed a veil of aerosols that wrapped around the globe. This veil reflected sunlight back into space, lowering temperatures across the northern hemisphere by as much as 3 degrees Celsius. 3 degrees doesn't sound like much, but when you're already living at the edge, when your harvest depends on a dozen warm days, when your livestock can't survive a week of snow in spring, 3 degrees is the difference between survival and famine. By 1816, the veil had spread, the skies dimmed, and the world began to starve. In the American Northeast, farmers watched in disbelief as ice formed on their water troughs in July. Seedlings wilted before they could root. Snow fell in New York in June. In Pennsylvania, men dug trenches through snowdrifts on what should have been summer roads. Livestock died in fields. Families slaughtered early or sold their animals in desperation, flooding the market and dropping prices even as food grew scarce. Parents wept as they buried children who had starved beside full barns filled with hay for oxen who could no longer plough. In Europe, the situation was no better. Already weakened by years of crop failure and the scars of the Napoleonic Wars, nations buckled. In Germany, food riots broke out in cities and towns, bakeries were looted, windows shattered, police beaten. In the countryside, theft of vegetables became a hanging crime. In England, Mary Shelley sat beside Lake Geneva, staring into a sky so grey and strange she barely recognised it. Trapped inside by unseasonal storms, she began to write a story about a monster born from lightning. The sky, she said, had become unnatural. In Switzerland, it snowed in June. Cows died in the pastures. People ate cats, dogs, bark. The government considered emergency grain imports but found none to buy. No one had any to spare. Letters from the time spoke of endless dusk, of children who never saw the sun. In China, the effect was different but no less cruel. The summer rains failed, drought set in. Then came the floods, then the famine. In India, the delay in the monsoon helped unleash a cholera epidemic that would claim tens of millions in the years to come. The roads were lined with bodies, and the sickness did not discriminate. And all of this from a mountain most people had never heard of, a mountain whose smoke choked the sky from thousands of miles away. The Little Ice Age was already decades into its long rule, but Tambora was a kingmaker. It accelerated the crisis. It revealed just how fragile life had become when climate stopped obeying the seasons. People looked upward, but the sun had changed. It was no longer yellow. It was white, thin, like a coin seen through water. And still the snows came. The confusion turned to fear. In Vermont, a young farmer recorded in his journal, "There is no summer this year. The ground is iron. The sky is smoke. I have heard the world may end." He wasn't alone. Across the northern hemisphere, doomsday sermons multiplied. Some called it punishment, others called it prophecy, but no one could call it normal. In cities, the poor fell first. Without food, without firewood, without protection from the strange, stinging chill that refused to leave. In London, grave diggers worked through the night in June. In Dublin, mobs attacked warehouses rumoured to contain flour. In Berlin, soup kitchens ran dry by noon. No one was prepared, and no one could fight the cold. The crops failed in waves. First the wheat, tender and sensitive to frost. Then barley, which needs time to ripen. Potatoes turned black beneath the earth. In New England, even the wild berries did not return. Beekeepers wept over dead hives. Orchards bore no fruit. Vineyards withered. And when there is no harvest, there is no seed for next year. So the terror deepened not just hunger now, but the knowledge that the hunger would last. Entire families fled their land, headed west, headed anywhere. Some drowned crossing rivers, others perished in forests, unprepared for nights that felt like February, though it was July. And yet, amid the desperation, stories emerged. In Massachusetts, a church community opened its doors day and night. They burned every pew, every pulpit, every table, just to keep the children warm. One man, who had stored flour for his daughter's wedding, gave it away loaf by loaf. He died later that winter, but the children who ate his bread lived. In Germany, a group of students from Jena travelled on foot to deliver barrels of soup to villages in Thuringia. They walked 80 kilometres through sleet and snow. When they arrived, the village priest said, "You are angels without wings." In southern France, monks opened their wine cellars and let the barrels go. Better drunk than rotted, one said, better shared than hoarded. But these acts, noble as they were, could not stop the march of misery. Tambora had set something in motion too vast to halt with kindness alone. By late 1816 the skies remained dim. The ash cloud still wrapped the planet, thinning only slowly, and as the year ended, there came no sense of rebirth, only more waiting. In the Ottoman Empire, snowfall reached into areas where it hadn't touched in living memory. In Hungary, it snowed every month for a year. In Nova Scotia, the sea froze 5 miles from shore. People cut holes in it to fish and burned the planks of their homes to cook the catch. One ship's captain sailing the Atlantic that winter wrote, "The air is wrong, the birds do not follow us, the stars are gone by morning." And everywhere the question, would the world return? Would the sun rise again the way it used to? Would the soil soften? Would lambs be born? Would trees blossom? Or was this the new order one where winter ruled, unchecked, unchallenged? The terror of Tambora was not just the cold, it was the uncertainty. Climate had always been the clockwork of life. The peasant sowed in March, reaped in August. The merchant shipped by river in spring, hauled by sled in winter. The weaver counted the light, the priest counted the fasts, the mother counted the days till bloom. Now the clock was broken, and in its silence fear grew. Still, people tried to carry on. They lit candles at noon. They saved seeds in the hope that one day warmth would return. They taught children to identify edible roots, to drink snow slowly, to sleep close, to listen for the cracking of roof beams under weight. In art and song and prayer, they immortalized the dark. One Swiss poem from 1816 read, "The moon is stronger than the sun, and the earth forgets its green." Another line followed, "But we still plant, we still hope." And that was true. They still planted, not because they believed, but because they had no other choice. Because life, even under a blackened sky, demands repetition. Plant, wait, pray, begin again. By the spring of 1817, the world began to breathe again, not evenly, not kindly, but there were signs. A thaw here, a sprout there. In some regions, the snow retreated early. Rivers began to flow. The sky remained pale, but the sun grew stronger. A bird returned. A single blossom opened on a hillside, and people, thin and grey and brittle as old wood, began to believe again. But the scars were deep. Entire villages had emptied. Markets were gone, roads overgrown. In places where cattle had once grazed, only bones remained. Church records showed missing years, no baptisms, no weddings, only burials. And yet, there was rebuilding. In Massachusetts, families planted with tools patched together from scrap. In Bavaria, neighbours shared ploughs and seed potatoes. In Wales, communal ovens were built not just for bread, but for gathering, for warmth, for survival. The ash from Tambora still circled the globe, but it was thinner now. Sunlight, though weak, no longer felt like dusk. And for the first time in 2 years, the seasons seemed to align with their names. Still, it wasn't over. The effects of the eruption rippled for a decade. In the Canadian Maritimes, forest growth slowed measurably. In the Alps, glacial advance continued long after Tambora went quiet. In South Asia, the The cholera epidemic, unleashed in the chaos of disrupted rainfall, spread along new, uncharted paths. And in people, something had changed. They no longer trusted the sky. They looked at a warm day with suspicion. They saved more, planted deeper, stored food longer. Children were taught not just to farm, but to observe the color of clouds, the shape of frost, the feel of wind before nightfall. The memory of 1816 became a warning. In lectures, priests and scientists alike debated what had happened. Most had no knowledge of Tambora. The connection wouldn't be fully understood for decades, but they knew something had shifted, that the world in its vastness could still break its own rhythm, and that we were fragile things beneath it. In art, the year without a summer appeared as strange skies, lonely landscapes, ghostly trees. In letters, it was spoken of as the Black Year, or the year the sun died. In songs, verses mourned the harvest that never came. But amid the sadness was also something else. Resilience. Not triumph, not victory, but endurance. In France, a widow rebuilt her vineyard, vine by vine, remembering the taste of wine before the frost. In Japan, farmers dug new irrigation paths, guided by changed rainfall. In America, towns held public grain reserves, guarded not by law but by trust. Communities remembered who had shared and who had hoarded. The famine had been a great test not only of agriculture, but of morality. And though the sky had turned black, the fire of mutual survival had not gone out. Tambora faded from view. The mountain remained, broken but quiet. The skies slowly cleared. The world, bruised and uncertain, kept spinning, and those who lived through it carried its memory forward. They told stories of ice in July, of milk freezing in pails before it reached the house, of bread made from tree bark, of brothers who walked miles through snow just to borrow a shovel, of sisters who held hands in bed to share body heat and whispered songs about the sun. These stories survived not just to remember hardship, but to honor it, to remind us that the world is vast, that mountains can reach across oceans, that the past is always just beneath our feet, waiting to rise again, and that even when the sky turns black, even when the light fails, people still plant, still wait, still believe, because they must. Because in every generation there is winter, and in every winter the seeds of spring sleep quietly beneath the frost, waiting for one warm day. They had always said the sea was dangerous, but during the Little Ice Age, it became something else entirely. It became unpredictable. The wind shifted strangely. Tides arrived early or not at all. Ice appeared where none had been seen in centuries. Harbours froze shut. Ports that had bustled with trade grew quiet under a sheen of frost and fear. And the sea, once a path to riches, became a gamble few could afford to lose. For centuries, Europe's maritime empires had been built on water. The Hanseatic League moved goods along the North and Baltic seas. The Dutch carried tulips and tea from Asia to Amsterdam. The English crossed the Atlantic in search of timber, fish, and furs. But these systems relied on rhythm, seasons, predictability, and when the weather changed, so did everything. Storms arrived without warning. Icebergs drifted farther south than any sailor remembered. Fog-cloaked coastlines for days, and entire fleets vanished without explanation. In 1625, a convoy of 5 Dutch merchant ships left Stockholm bound for the North Sea. They never arrived. Months later, pieces of hull and broken crates washed up along the Norwegian coast. The logs, when recovered, described strange currents, a sudden cold, and sails that froze stiff overnight. They had drifted into a graveyard of ice. These were not isolated events. Records from the British Admiralty during the 17th and 18th centuries show a sharp rise in shipwrecks due to weather. Insurance costs soared. Some voyages were postponed for entire seasons, and merchants began to seek overland routes despite the slowness and cost just to avoid the sea. Fishing, too, was transformed. Communities along the coast of Iceland, Norway, Scotland, and even New England saw their catches decline, not because fish disappeared but because the patterns changed. Herring moved to deeper waters, cod vanished from traditional banks. Ice covered the inlets where nets had once been cast with ease. Fishermen died in growing numbers, not from hunger but from storms. They launched in small boats, desperate for food or coin, only to be caught in squalls that no longer respected the calendar. One English journal from 1683 notes, "A terrible gale on the feast of St. Anne. We had thought summer safe. We were wrong. 4 boats gone, no bodies returned." The ice pushed south. In some winters, the Baltic Sea froze entirely from Sweden to Estonia. People walked from one country to another. Temporary inns were set up on the ice. But beneath this surreal new world was disaster. Trade halted, ships trapped, economies stalled. The Dutch, whose power depended on water, suffered deeply. Their famed merchant fleet sat idle, boxed in by frozen canals. Goods rotted in warehouses, sailors went unpaid. The country that had once harnessed the sea with dikes and windmills now found itself prisoner to a colder tide. And then there were the polar explorers, drawn by dreams of a northwest passage, of new lands, of glory. They met the little ice age head-on. Most never returned. In 1697, a French expedition seeking a faster route to China vanished in the Arctic. Years later, Inuit hunters reported finding strange metal tools and frozen bodies in European clothes. The sea had not just resisted them, it had consumed them. Even piracy waned. The famous corsairs of the Mediterranean found their range restricted. Icy conditions made hiding in coves harder. Ships were easier to track in snow-covered inlets. The sea became less a playground and more a trap. And still people tried, because the sea, dangerous or not, was still a lifeline. For salt, for cod, for trade, for escape. They built stronger hulls, reinforced masts. They studied wind patterns with desperate precision, tracking every storm, every deviation. In London, merchants paid scholars to predict the weather months in advance. Most failed. But sometimes they got lucky. Sometimes they reached port. And sometimes they didn't. There is a record in the Swedish National Archives of a single ship that sailed from Gothenburg in 1741. It was carrying grain, a rare cargo that winter. The captain had waited 3 extra weeks for signs of a thaw. When the harbour finally cracked open, he ordered the crew aboard and set out. They were never seen again. Later that year, when the ice receded, fishermen found the ship, still afloat, locked in an eddy near a rocky coast, no one on board, no bodies, just frost-covered sacks of wheat, perfectly preserved. It had become a ghost, one of many left behind by the sea. In the harbours, ships grew fewer. Masts once clustered like trees now stood alone. Wharves that had echoed with calls of sailors and the squeal of winches lay still, wrapped in a quiet cold. Ice formed at the edges of docks, creeping inward day by day. Barnacles died in frozen tide pools. Rats abandoned the holds in droves. And with each passing year, coastal economies shrank. Not through collapse but attrition. One fewer voyage, one fewer ship. A captain retires early. A fisherman moves inland. A merchant opens a shop instead of risking another winter run to Hamburg. This quiet withdrawal from the sea reshaped entire regions. In Portugal, wine exports declined as maritime routes became too dangerous. In Norway, dried fish that once fed Europe spoiled in warehouses. In the Netherlands, colonial expeditions were postponed, then cancelled altogether, not for lack of will but for lack of safe passage. And those who stayed on the water had to adapt. Sailors learned to read the sky differently. A strange halo around the moon meant not romance, but ice. Winds from the northeast might bring trade one day and a blizzard the next. They changed sails, shorter, stronger. They carried extra food, knowing a journey that once took 5 days might stretch to 15. And in some parts of the world, entirely new ship designs emerged. In the North Atlantic, hulls were widened to resist crush ice. In Finland and the Baltic coast, smaller crafts were developed that could be dragged over ice patches if needed. But no amount of innovation could erase the risk. The sea had turned treacherous in new ways. Fog lingered for weeks, thick, heavy, and unmovable. Compasses sometimes gave false readings as magnetic fields shifted under the pressure of unknown changes in the atmosphere. And icebergs became wanderers, drifting far beyond their traditional range. One such iceberg was recorded off the coast of France in 1732. The sailors who saw it described it as a mountain upon the water, glistening with blue fire. They fled south. Others weren't so lucky. There were whispers half believed, half feared of ghost ships. Silent vessels adrift, crewless, sails in tatters, ice on every beam. Superstition grew in the absence of understanding. Some said the sea was angry. Others believed God had withdrawn his hand from the oceans, letting chaos rule. In Iceland, folk tales from this period spoke of the sea freezing from the bottom up, trapping ships like flies in amber. In Ireland, poems mourned lost fishermen as bridegrooms to the cold bride of the tide, and still the sea drew them back, because land was no guarantee either. Crops failed inland, towns starved, coal ran low. Sometimes, even with all the risks, the sea was still the best hope. To find fish, to reach trade, to escape famine. And so they launched. Sailors wrapped in animal hides, ships corked with extra pitch, prayers whispered into the morning mist as the tide took them out. Mothers wept, fathers offered last blessings, children waved from snow-covered docks. The voyage had always been perilous, but now it was a negotiation with fate. Those who survived told stories that walked the line between truth and miracle, of waves that froze mid-crest, of seals seen miles inland, lost on floating ice, of lightning that cracked across a sky already dusted with snow. In one journal, a sailor described waking to silence no creak of wood, no crash of water, only the sound of his own heartbeat as he stepped onto the deck to find the ship locked in ice, surrounded by a frozen sea stretching in every direction. They waited 2 weeks. Meltkame slowly. They lived off candle wax and dried herring. They made fire in barrels. They sang to keep their minds. When the thaw finally came, they paddled free using oars meant for lifeboats. But they made it home. Most did not. The sea, once the artery of empire, had become a gatekeeper. It let some pass. It took others forever. The ripple of maritime collapse extended far beyond coastlines. When ships stopped sailing, markets stalled. When harbours froze, empires trembled. Cinnamon from Ceylon, sugar from the Caribbean, tea from China, these luxuries dulled or vanished entirely from European tables. But it wasn't just a matter of taste, it was survival. Salted fish didn't arrive where it was needed. Grain that once moved freely across seas rotted in ports. Wool and linen sat in warehouses, unsold. The great ocean arteries of trade had turned sluggish, even clotted, and the world's economies suffered a slow strangulation. Insurance companies failed, loans defaulted, and on the docks, the workers starved first. They were the ones who had depended not on land, but on tide. Caulkers, rope makers, coopersmiths, sail repairers, chandlers, tallymen all saw their professions wither as the ships disappeared into frost or legend. Cities like Bristol, Hamburg, and Bergen lost their rhythm. The sound of hammer on hull, rope creaking over pulleys, the yells of captains and stevedores, all of it faded beneath a curtain of endless winter air. In desperation, some turned to ice navigation. not by breaking it but by embracing it. On the Baltic, sledges were fitted with sails and used to race across frozen seas to trade or smuggle. In parts of Russia, sleigh convoys replaced coastal shipping routes. They carried flour, candles, soap, and news across tracks scraped into the snow by teams of horses bound in frost-stiff leather. This, too, came with risk. A misstep, and the ice could open. A thaw, and the track would vanish. A snow squall, and an entire convoy could go missing in a world suddenly made white and blind. Yet it was all they had. There are accounts from Denmark of ice ports, temporary settlements built atop thick winter pack. Entire economies that existed only between the freeze and the first crack. Tents made from old sails. Braziers burning ship tar. Merchants exchanging coins with gloved hands, listening for groans in the ice beneath them. The danger was constant, but so was the need. Even navies weren't spared. Ships of war froze in dry dock. Naval planning shifted less about expansion, more about endurance. Coastal patrols were shortened. Sailors rotated faster. Many dismissed early. And in some rare cases, opposing fleets simply stopped fighting, choosing retreat over engagement because both captains knew the sea was a greater threat than the cannon. Nature, for a time, achieved what diplomacy could not. The sea became a neutral force by sheer hostility. In the colonies, things fared no better. Ships bearing colonial officials, missionaries, or settlers faced extreme delays. Food shortages in far ports caused mutiny and revolt. News of decisions made in Europe arrived too late to matter. The oceanic tether had stretched thin, and the sense of empire once so immediate became abstract. In journals and letters, the ocean became a metaphor, not for opportunity, but for uncertainty. One merchant wrote in 1752, "There is a great silence now between us and the Indies. I fear the sea has turned its back on men." And yet the sea remained, waiting. It was not destroyed by ice, only changed, and with the eventual warming, it returned. Slowly, the trade winds regained their pattern. Currents found their course. The ice receded northward. Harbours cleared. Shipyards groaned back to life. And in time, the sea once again filled with sails, white and wide and full of promise. But things were never quite the same. New ship designs took ice into account. Shipping logs began to record not just dates and cargo, but sea temperatures and sky colour. The idea of maritime seasons became more cautious. Families of sailors began keeping private almanacs, insurance against what might come again. And in the minds of those who had lived through it, the ocean was marked, not just as a vast blue space, but as a memory of hunger, of loss, of ships that never returned. Children were taught not just how to knot rope, but how to read ice. Of all the lessons the Little Ice Age taught, this one was clearest at sea, that the world could change suddenly, and that the sea, for all its openness, could close like a fist. The sailors who came after would never forget that. Nor would we. The trees once marked the turning of seasons. In spring, buds appeared. In summer, leaves shaded. In autumn, they blazed with colour. In winter, they rested. But during the Little Ice Age, something changed. Spring came late, summer came shallow, and winter, once a temporary guest, now built a permanent camp beneath the branches. Forests became colder, quieter, stranger. Snow lingered into May. Frost came in October. Bark split open from the freeze. Sap slowed to a crawl. In some years, the buds never broke. In others, a tree would bloom, only to die weeks later from a second, brutal frost. In Scandinavia, entire birch groves failed to leaf. In the Carpathians, pine forests fell silent. No birds, no wind, only the soft collapse of branches under the weight of unexpected snow. Timber merchants panicked. Wood was life. It fueled the hearth, built the homes, mended the ships, and braced the barns. It made barrels, wheels, tools, bridges, and furniture. In places without coal, it was the currency of survival. And now, it was failing. Some trees adapted. The slow-growing beech, the resilient spruce, the squat mountain oak, these persisted, though their growth rings narrowed, telling a story of each lean year. But others struggled. Walnut, poplar, chestnut, their trunks cracked, their cores hollowed, their roots drowned in frozen soil that refused to drain. And so the people turned to what they had. Deadfall, old beams, abandoned buildings. Entire cottages were dismantled, not out of malice, but necessity. Roofs became firewood, floorboards became kindling. The forest moved inward, becoming part of the home, only to vanish up the chimney. In Germany, a phrase emerged: Holzhunger, wood hunger. It was not poetic. It was real. In the Harz Mountains, wood thieves were hanged. In Poland, soldiers guarded timber roads. In England, laws were passed to ration oak for shipbuilding fines for private use. In France, forests were nationalized and strictly patrolled. Peasants caught gathering twigs could face jail. And yet, demand grew, because cold demands fuel, and the cold did not care for law. In Bohemia, women scavenged forests by moonlight, gathering bark and pine cones. In Bavaria, children were trained to spot the driest branches. In Norway, villages sent scouts ahead of winter to mark trees for cutting before the snow made them unreachable. But even in this hardship, a kind of culture bloomed. Wood carving became an act of reverence. Each beam was shaped with care, knowing it might be the last. People began decorating firewood with symbols not out of superstition, but out of memory. A good piece of wood was not just fuel, it was a blessing. Songs were sung about trees. A Danish lullaby from the 1602 speaks of the ash that warms the babe and the birch that holds the mother's roof. In Slavic villages, the oldest trees were given names and visited on feast days. They were not gods, but they were givers, and when even these failed, the people turned to peat. They dug into marshes, pulling out sodden bricks of decomposed plant matter. Dried slowly, they burned with a slow, sullen flame, not warm, but enough. In Ireland and Scotland, peat became primary. Tools were invented to cut it, dry it, stack it. Peat walls rose where trees had once grown. Children played in peat piles. Families knelt beside peat fires and whispered prayers. In other places, they burned dung. Mixed with straw, it made a harsh smoke, but it warmed, and warmth was the new wealth. The forests retreated under the axe. In Hungary, noble estates saw their groves vanish. In Transylvania, old-growth forests were cleared within a decade. The hills grew bald. Landslides became common. Springs ran dry. But no one could afford to stop, because the cold was not stopping, and neither was the hunger. The toll on the land was profound. Forests that had stood for centuries, untouched groves where monks once walked and kings once hunted, now disappeared, year by year, tree by tree, not from conquest, but from need, not with axes raised in conquest, but with hands shaking in desperation. In Switzerland, valley slopes once shaded by ancient pines became bare and sun-scorched in summer, muddy and unstable in winter. In Austria, the Black Forest was no longer black, but patchy, thin, interrupted by stumps and brush. Travellers who once sheltered beneath canopies now crossed open ground under falling snow. The shift was more than ecological. It was psychological. The forest had always been a place of mystery, of danger, of shadow, but it had also been a refuge, a pantry, a temple, a map of memory. Now it became something else, a dwindling reservoir of survival, where every branch held a question: burn it or save it. Communities learned new rhythms. Woodcutting became strategic. South-facing slopes were prioritized, they dried faster. Deadwood was gathered first, not for its quality, but to preserve the living. Sledges were used in summer, when snow lingered high in the passes and could still carry heavy loads downhill. In places, wood became currency. A wagon load of dry oak might be traded for a month's grain. Beech logs were marked with seals, proof of tax paid, legal ownership claimed. In towns near the Rhine, fines were levied in cords, not coin. Even theft evolved. In Finland, it was said the best thieves stole nothing from homes but from the forest. A single night's cut might feed a family and damn a man. Jails filled with those who had taken too much bark or gathered too many fallen limbs. And the forests, pressured and thinned, began to change. Animals vanished. Birdsong grew scarce in the mornings. The fox, the lynx, the wolf all retreated deeper into the mountains. Some never returned. Where trees had buffered wind, the cold now swept through. Where roots had held soil, erosion now gnashed the earth. Floods increased. Roads washed away. Crops drowned. And so a new effort was born, not to harvest, but to manage. Forest wardens emerged. In Saxony and Bavaria, they walked daily paths, counting saplings, measuring trunks, marking diseased trees. In France, the Code Forestier was passed, enforcing sustainable harvests, punishing overcutting, and assigning quotas. But such efforts often came too late or too uneven. The poorest still needed wood, the richest still took what they pleased, and the cold, indifferent to both, pressed on. But the people, ever adapting, began to change not just how they gathered wood, but how they used it. Houses shrank. Rooms were clustered tightly around a single chimney. Families slept in shifts, stacked like logs themselves, to share heat. Doors were sealed with fabric, windows shuttered. Furniture built smaller to retain space, and in the hearth, every scrap was used. Old tools, broken wheels, wooden toys, nothing was wasted. Stoves were redesigned. The Russian pechka, the German Kachlofen, the Swedish kakelun. These weren't just sources of heat, they were engineering marvels. Slow burning, radiating warmth through tiles or stone, retaining heat for hours after the last ember died. They became the heart of the home. Children leaned against them. Bread rose beside them. Cats curled atop them. In paintings from the era, the stove is almost a family member, ever-present, central, revered. And still, it wasn't enough, because winter was always ahead. So they adapted again. In Poland, woven wood mats were placed under beds. In Italy, chestnut shells were burned for scent and heat. In Russia, bundles of birch bark were soaked in oil to stretch their burn time. Innovation became a matter of breath, a warm breath, a breath not frozen before it left the mouth. And always, in the distance, the silhouette of trees. Fewer, farther, but still standing, still holding out against the wind. And then, in time, the forests began to recover. Not quickly, not fully, but the signs were there. Saplings appeared along old logging trails. Hillsides, once shaved to soil, now bore a thin fuzz of green. Pines returned, first resilient, fast-growing, eager. Then the slower ones, beech, chestnut, even oak. Where once stumps had marked desperation, shoots now marked hope. The little ice age began to recede. Storms still came, frost still arrived, but it no longer clung to the land like a curse. Springs grew longer, summers warmer, and with that warmth the forests stretched again. But people had changed. They remembered what it meant to lose the trees. And so new customs formed not out of law, but out of memory. In the Swiss Alps, for every tree felled, 2 were planted. In the Ardennes, families marked birthdays by placing saplings near their homes. In Bohemia, children learned the names of trees as early as they learned the names of saints. A reverence had taken root. In Germany, the concept of Waldpflege, forest care, emerged. It wasn't just management, it was stewardship, a recognition that the forest was not a resource, but a partner. Artists captured this new intimacy. Paintings no longer showed the forest as dark, menacing, unknowable. Instead, it appeared as haven, filtered light, quiet groves, the gentle curve of branches. Writers described trees not as backdrop, but as character, living beings with moods, with memories, with presence. And in the village square, wood once again became celebration. Maypoles rose in spring, bonfires lit the solstice, timber frames returned to architecture not just for function, but for pride. A well-carved beam was a sign of respect, a polished floorboard, a mark of care. The memory of scarcity gave way to a culture of attention. Houses were still small, but now by design, not necessity. Hearths still central, but now more symbolic than survival. Children no longer searched forests for firewood. They wandered for play, for mushrooms, for pine cones, for stories. The forest returned, but it returned changed. There were gaps that would not be filled for generations. There were species lost once common, now remembered only in song or record. The wolf, in many places, did not return. The lynx remained a rumour, and the oldest trees, the ones that had shaded centuries, were gone. But still, the green came back. In a world warming, new dangers rose. Floods, droughts, shifting patterns. But those who had survived the deep winters understood something essential, that the forest was both fragile and strong, that it could vanish and return, that it could shelter and burn, that it needed care. And so, the cultures that had once stripped the hills to survive began to grow them again, not just for wood, but for soul. In Norway, a poem passed from mother to daughter reads, "The forest feeds, the cold forgets, but we remember and plant again." And in that planting, there is defiance, not against nature, but against forgetting, because every tree planted after the Little Ice Age was a sentence in a larger story. One that said, "We endured, we learned, and we will not take green for granted again." The human body is a record keeper, and in the centuries of the Little Ice Age, it kept a long and painful journal etched in bone, in skin, and most tellingly, in teeth. Before the cold, teeth had been markers of class. The rich smiled in white or gold. The poor smiled in brown or broken. But during the cold centuries, the frost cared for neither wealth nor bloodline. It crept into every jaw, every meal, every breath, and it changed the mouth forever. The first change came in diet. Harvests failed. Grain grew mouldy in damp barns. Vegetables withered in frost. Orchards bore no fruit. The sweet, fibrous foods that once helped cleanse the mouth were gone. In their place, hard crusts, dried roots, salted meats, and anything that could last. Preservation became priority. Salt, smoke, vinegar, fermentation. These methods kept food from rotting, but they didn't keep it gentle. Salt burned the gums. Vinegar eroded enamel. Fermented rye, a staple in many peasant homes, produced acids that clung to molars. And for those lucky enough to still eat sugar, mostly the rich, the problem was worse, because sugar was cheap, and decay is democratic. Even the wealthy, once immune to hunger, now faced the cold with brittle mouths. Portraits of 18th century aristocrats show closed-lip smiles not out of etiquette, but embarrassment. Diaries whisper of blackened teeth. Courtiers carried cloves not for fragrance, but to mask the scent of rot. Dentistry, such as it was, lagged far behind. Tooth extraction was brutal. Barbers and blacksmiths often doubled as dental surgeons. The tools were crude. The pain was immense. A common belief: if the tooth ached, pull it. If it festered, cauterize. If it spread, pray. Anesthesia, a myth. Some chewed on leather. Others drank until unconscious. Most simply endured. One letter from a French merchant in 1703 describes his wife's suffering. She wakes with blood on the pillow, the cheek swollen as if with child. The priest came, not to save but to ease her. She did not eat for 9 days. She sang hymns through cracked lips. Then she slept. The poor fared worse. Without access to leeches, let alone surgical steel, they turned to folk remedies. Burnt ash mixed with honey to soothe the nerve. Garlic and lard, packed into cavities. Cold river stones, held against the jaw. Some swore by dog hair burned at midnight. Others by snail slime collected during the new moon. None worked, because the pain was not just in the tooth. It was in the bone, in the blood, in the cold. Winter made everything slower, healing, circulation, resilience. Gums shrank, jaws ached, infections spread quickly, sometimes fatally. The mouth is the entrance to death, said one Bavarian midwife, and often it was. But even as suffering mounted, adaptation followed. The people changed how they ate. Bread was soaked in broth. Meat was stewed until it fell apart. Herbs known for their warming qualities, sage, thyme, clove, were not just used for taste, but for numbing, for easing the dull throb of a frozen molar. And slowly, new traditions formed. In the Alps, a paste of charcoal and salt was rubbed on teeth before sleep. In Poland, apple bark was chewed after meals. In Wales, children were given tiny twigs to chew birch or hazel, both to clean the teeth and strengthen the jaw. Early toothbrushes emerged little more than bundled straw or horsehair brushes, but they marked a turning point, the beginning of awareness, of care, even amid the cold. But perhaps the most profound shift was cultural. Teeth became not just a marker of age or class, but of endurance. In many regions, songs described lovers with teeth like stone, or a mouth unbroken by winter. Soldiers were praised for biting hard bread without flinching. Mothers checked their children's mouths like doctors, counting molars like coins. The smile became less about beauty and more about survival. To show teeth intact, uncracked, unblackened was to say, I made it, I ate, I lived. In churchyards and crypts, the bones tell the rest. Archaeologists studying burial sites from the 15th to 18th centuries find a stark pattern: worn enamel, exposed pulp, cracked crowns, decay down to the root. Children as young as 4 with full molar collapse, adults with abscesses so large they had etched into the jaw. These were not isolated cases. They were the norm. The Little Ice Age left fingerprints in every mouth it touched. In London, remains from plague-era pits show rapid dental degeneration not from disease, but diet. In rural Denmark, skeletons bear teeth ground down to the gum, likely from chewing gritty rye or bark during food shortages. In Hungary, skulls recovered from cold climate graves show evidence of self-extraction molars missing with no signs of toolwork, only trauma. This was not neglect. It was adaptation. The people had no dentists, no anesthetic, no metal fillings, but they had hands, courage, pain thresholds hardened by years of cold. They did what they could, and sometimes they succeeded. Because amidst the agony, innovation crept in. By the mid-1600s, rudimentary prosthetics appeared. Animal bones shaped into plugs, wooden pegs hammered into gums. Even gold wiring, for those with coin, laced between remaining teeth to hold shape or assist chewing. None of it was comfortable, but it allowed one to speak, to smile, to eat. And eating had become a question of survival more than pleasure. The foods of the era tell their own story. Porridges made from cracked grains, gentle on broken molars. Potted meats, slow cooked into softness. Root vegetables boiled into mash. Even the once ritualistic hardness of bread shifted. In Germany, the famed black rye loaves were sliced thin and steamed. In France, broth bowls were made deep and wide, less for soup and more for soaking. A new etiquette arose. No shame in dipping. You didn't tear bread with your teeth. You softened it, nursed it, let it melt. People learned to chew with their front teeth when the back failed. They chewed slowly, thoughtfully, like every bite was a negotiation with pain. And when even that failed, there was gruel, warmed oats, millet pudding, soup from barley and bones, a spoon, a bowl, a fire that was a meal. Teeth were no longer just anatomical tools. They were weathered instruments chipped by hardship, reshaped by famine, honored in silence. In families, old age wasn't marked by grey hair or stooped shoulders, but by the number of teeth left. My grandmother still has 10, someone might say with pride, and when a tooth fell, it was kept, wrapped in cloth, placed in jars, tucked behind beams, not as superstition but remembrance, proof of having endured. Children were taught to protect their teeth, like they would a loaf of bread. Don't bite ice. Don't chew hard root. Always rinse with snowmelt if the mouth bleeds. These were the new rules. Passed not from doctor to patient, but mother to child, neighbour to neighbour. The mouth became a communal concern. In some villages, tooth circles formed groups who shared their home remedies, their softest foods, their little wisdoms. Boil mint leaves, rub with apple vinegar, use the bark of young aspen, not old. Even travellers carried tooth powders, mixtures of burnt eggshell, salt, crushed sage, carried in pouches, dabbed with a finger. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about endurance. And endurance was everything, because even a small infection, untreated, unchecked, could kill. Fever, blood poisoning, jaw collapse, all starting with one molar, one abscess, one tiny hole left unfilled in a freezing winter. And still they smiled. Not often, not wide, but enough. Enough to say, I am here. Enough to defy the pain. Because, in the Little Ice Age, every tooth held a story. Of famine, of adaptation, of quiet, aching courage. With time, dentistry evolved, but never fast enough for the people of the Little Ice Age. By the 18th century, rudimentary dental manuals began circulating among the wealthy. One such pamphlet, printed in Amsterdam in 1761, described how to clean teeth using linen cloth soaked in wine, vinegar, and burnt salt. Another, published in Edinburgh, recommended to pierce the gum with a silver probe when the pain does not relent, a method that did little but inspire more bleeding. But there were signs of progress. Porcelain teeth, fragile, expensive, but beautiful, appeared in French salons. They were less for chewing than for display. Smiles returned to paintings, if not to life. More common were dentures made from animal bone or ivory, shaped with painstaking care. Often, these were anchored with springs, requiring the wearer to consciously bite down to keep the device closed. Many chose to remove them when not in company, preferring the silence of a toothless mouth to the clack of mechanical substitutes. But most people still lived far from such luxuries. In rural Europe, the mouth remained a battlefield, and as the Little Ice Age waned, its legacy remained embedded in the jaws of those who survived it. Even today, archaeologists can trace its passage by the dentition of the dead. Teeth tell of poor nutrition, of stress during growth, of long winters with nothing but salted pork and black bread. Enamel lines called Wilson bands mark moments of starvation, visible freezes in a child's development, where hunger slowed the body and left a record in the tooth. But for every scar, there is also a sign of resilience. Teeth restructured to chew on only one side, lower jaws grown wider to accommodate loss above. Layers of tartar that accidentally preserved microscopic particles of ancient meals, onions, grains, herbs. A full history, trapped in plaque. In this way, the human mouth is not only a vessel of suffering but of memory. And memory outlives pain. Even as the climate warmed, traditions lingered. Soft foods remained staples in kitchens long after necessity faded. Boiled barley, mashed turnip, spiced gruel, comfort food, born from cold, recipes passed down not for taste but for safety. Mothers still warned, chew slow, don't bite the crust first, warm your teeth before going out into frost. Some of these warnings became superstition, others became wisdom. All were rooted in truth, truth paid for in blood and nerve. And slowly, the smile changed. Not just in health, but in meaning. To smile during the Little Ice Age was not merely to express joy, it was to assert strength. To show teeth whole or not was to testify that one had eaten, endured, healed. Even the gap-toothed smile of a grandmother bore honor. These are the teeth that survived the hunger. In time, dentistry became science. Nations opened dental colleges. New tools emerged: scalers, drills, anesthetics, fillings made of gold, then silver, then mercury, toothbrushes with bristles from boars, then nylon, paste from chalk, then fluoride. But long before this, there had been the toothpick carved from a pine twig, the cloth soaked in snowmelt, the whispered prayer over a pot of broth, the trembling finger feeling for a molar too hot to touch. These were the first dentists, untrained, unknown, but necessary, because a warm bed meant little if you couldn't chew, and even the richest stew gave no comfort if your mouth was open to rot. In the legacy of the Little Ice Age, we find the foundation of modern oral care not in science but in survival. A culture built not on perfect teeth, but on the will to keep eating. A tradition carved not in ivory, but in hardship. A smile shaped not by aesthetics, but by courage. And so, when we look back on this era, its cracked enamel, its soot-stained molars, its whispered songs of aching jaws, we see not ugliness, but triumph. Because every tooth kept, every bite swallowed, every night survived in pain was an act of defiance against the cold. And in that defiance, something beautiful remained. A mouth that could still speak, still sing, still smile. Before gaslight, before electricity, before even the humble kerosene lamp, there was the flame. A flicker in the dark, a promise, a warning, a fragile separation between order and chaos. And during the cold, unrelenting centuries of the Little Ice Age, that flicker became sacred. Because the darkness grew deeper. Nights stretched longer. Clouds covered the moon more often. Snow reflected no light, only silence. In the far north, daylight dwindled to an hour. In the south, storms drowned the stars. The world that had once dimmed at dusk now vanished. And in that void, the only certainty was fire. Not just for warmth, but for sight, for movement, for memory. The candle was not a luxury. It was a necessity, but it was also expensive. In parts of Europe, a single candle cost a day's labor. In others, it was rationed one stub per family, per night. Beeswax was for the church, for the lords, for the dead. The living made do with tallow animal fat, congealed and smoky, sputtering in the cold. The flame danced in every home, on the hearthstone, in the lantern, in the cupped hand of a child walking to the barn. It became the center of life after sunset. Around it, people ate, spoke, mended, read, if they were lucky enough to have books, prayed, if they had hope. And when it died, the room folded in on itself. Darkness was not just the absence of light, it was the presence of fear. Rats moved more freely. Frost crept from the walls. Ghost stories weren't entertainment. They were instruction. Stay close. Don't wander. Don't tempt the things that live where the light does not reach. Children were taught the importance of the wick. Never leave a candle unattended. Never let it drip. Trim it nightly. Protect it with glass. Shield it from drafts. And most of all, never waste it. A flickering candle might represent tomorrow's only light. In villages, the candle stump was passed between homes. Families shared the last inch. The poor lit rushlights, thin reeds dipped in tallow, cheap and fast-burning. They smoked and sputtered and stank, but they burned. In the castles of the rich, Chandeliers hung heavy with wax. Rooms glowed gold and amber, but even here, care was taken. Wax was expensive. Light, even amid wealth, was rationed. A hall might shine for a feast and then darken for weeks. In monasteries, monks crafted their own candles. Some wrote by the slow burn of a single flame, timing prayers by the rate of melt. In nunneries, candles were kept near the infirmary, a light for those dying. The belief, no soul should leave in darkness. Even in death, the flame had its place. Wakes were held by candlelight, graves dug before the sun rose. A single taper placed beside the coffin, burning until the wax surrendered to mourning. Because the dark was never just dark. It was cold, it was quiet, it was unrelenting. And so people fought it one flame at a time. Fireplaces became larger, not for heat alone, but for light. The hearth was no longer just a place to cook, it was the stage of life. Entire rooms were designed around it. Benches built into the stonework, hooks for kettles, racks for drying, mantles for candles. Families moved closer together at night. They shared beds, shared breath, shared stories, and they shared fire. One coal could relight a household. One ember passed from neighbour to neighbour in a covered pot. A ritual, a responsibility. Matches did not yet exist, so the fire must never die. If it did, flint and steel would spark again, but not easily. Sometimes it took hours, and fingers bled before flame was born anew. So when a fire went out, people wept, not in drama, but in despair, because without fire, there was only cold, and without light, only the long dark. But in this darkness, resilience shone brightest. Entire cultures formed around fire. In the Alps, families built fire niches into the walls, small altars for flame. In Sweden, a tradition called ljuskrona light crowns lit winter tables with handmade candles shaped like stars. In Italy, processions of light marked solstice nights, with children carrying torches through frozen streets. And in every home, the act of lighting a candle became more than habit. It was hope, hope that the night would pass, hope that the cold would break, hope that tomorrow might dawn, and with it, another inch of wax to burn. The longer the night, the more precious the glow. Even a single spark struck from stone, coaxed into dry moss, breathed into flame was a victory, a small rebellion against the vast black world outside. In the countryside, entire communities planned their evenings around light. The baker finished before dusk. The seamstress stitched only as long as the candle allowed. Children memorized lessons by firelight and recited them aloud in the dark. Farmers recounted the day's labours not around a dinner table, but around the hearth, each face flickering in orange and shadow. Time was kept not by clocks but by candles. A common measure, 1 inch per hour. Scribes and scholars marked progress by wax strips. A sermon's length, someone might say, meaning the time it takes a candle to reach its midpoint. A confession's flicker, meaning barely any time at all. In towns and cities, night watchmen carried lanterns, heavy boxes of glass and tin, glowing dimly through snow. They knocked their staffs on stone at each hour, not only to keep time but to prove they were still alive, still watching. And on some streets, candles were placed in windows after sunset, not as decoration, but as invitation. A lighted window meant, we are home. A dark window meant, pray for us. During the worst winters, some towns coordinated shared lighting schedules. Everyone lit their candle at the same time, a soft chorus of flame rising along cobbled roads. It was not enough to banish the dark, but it was enough to remind people they were not alone in it. This communal sense of light became ritual. In Eastern Europe, candle blessing ceremonies emerged. The wax was mixed with herbs, the wicks soaked in holy oil. These were not just tools, they were charms, talismans against the cold and the shadows beyond. Each flame held meaning. A candle placed at the threshold to keep spirits out. a candle in the barn to protect the animals, a candle beside the cradle to guard the newborn from winter's breath. Even the act of extinguishing a candle was sacred. One did not blow it out casually. Instead, fingers were licked and pinched over the wick. Some whispered thanks. Others crossed themselves, because fire was never to be mocked. To abuse flame was to invite darkness in return, and fire had memory. It remembered who respected it, who tended it, who kept it safe. In Iceland, legends told of night flames, ghosts of neglected fires that wandered into homes where candles had been left to die without care. They whispered through walls, they stole warmth. They turned rooms colder than the snow outside, so even children were taught reverence. They were told stories of the candle eater, a creature that visited homes where wax was wasted. It fed on light, and once it arrived, no fire would stay lit again. A tale, yes, but one with truth at its heart. Light was finite, and winter was long, so every bit of flame was husbanded. In kitchens, grease drippings were saved not to eat, but to mix with fibre and make crude lamps. In forests, tree resin was collected pitch to coat rushlights, making them burn longer. In monasteries, leftover wax was melted, filtered, repoured candles reborn again and again, like the seasons that refused to come. Even daylight was captured. Windows were widened, walls painted white, reflective pans placed behind candles to double their shine. In some places, mirrors were used not for vanity, but for light. A single flame multiplied tenfold. And when all else failed, when wax was gone, when rushes were burned, when the night pressed too closely, there remained the fire within. Voices, songs, memory, the telling of stories, the singing of old songs, the rhythm of words passed from mouth to mouth like coals from hearth to hearth. Because sometimes, light was not what you saw but what you heard. A grandmother's tale of the frost giant that stole sunlight, a boy's whispered prayer to the virgin flame, a woman's song, low and steady, to keep her baby asleep until dawn. These became their own kind of light, not of wax, but of will. And then came the innovations that promised to banish the dark for good. In the early 18th century, the oil lamp evolved no longer just an open bowl of flame, but a glass-enclosed device, drawing whale oil through cotton wicks. It burned longer, brighter, cleaner. But it was expensive. Few could afford it. Fewer still had access to the oil. Then, the kerosene lamp, easier, cheaper, zaffer. It arrived late in the story of the Little Ice Age, but just in time to light the final chapters. A single lamp could illuminate an entire room. No more dripping tallow. No more rushes that guttered in wind. It changed how people lived after dark. Evenings grew longer. The rhythm of life began to shift. Work hours extended. Reading became more common. Families lingered together, not huddled in flickering orange, but sitting around a steady, confident glow. And yet candles did not vanish. Even as technology marched forward, the old flame held its ground. Because candles were not just light. They were ritual, memory, presence. A candle lit for the dead, a candle at the table, a candle on the windowsill. These were not replaced by kerosene or gas or bulbs. They were something older, deeper. In rural homes, even in the 19th century, candle making remained a seasonal task. Wax was saved, wicks braided, moulds packed in boxes, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter. It wasn't just tradition, it was identity. To make your own light, to shape it, to control it, was power. And the candle retained that power. Even now, in an age of LEDs and smart lights, we still return to the flame. We light candles in cathedrals and on birthday cakes. We light them when we grieve, when we celebrate, when we hope. We light them not because we need to see, but because we need to feel. Something steady, something quiet, something alive. Because the candle is alive. It breathes, it flickers, it responds. In the Little Ice Age, people saw it as a companion, not just a thing but a presence. When a candle burned low, they felt time slipping. When it flared, they felt watched. When it died, they felt alone. And so they tended it like a life, trimmed it, fed it, guarded it, because in a world where darkness could kill, the smallest light was a shield. And every family, rich or poor, kept that shield close. We forget now how complete the dark once was, how loud, how absolute. We forget that there were nights when entire villages vanished into shadow, and the only sign of life was a single speck of flame behind a shutter. But they remembered. They remembered how it felt to hold the last stub of wax, the last dry reed, the last hope of light. They remembered what it meant to ration brightness, to pray for dawn, not just for warmth, but for the chance to see. And they remembered what it meant to carry fire forward generation to generation, not just in hearths, but in hearts. Because the candle was never only about illumination. It was about survival. It was about control. It was about declaring to the dark, "You may come, but not without resistance, and not without flame." Snow has a sound, or rather it softens sound, muffles it, swallows it. In a forest blanketed by white, footsteps vanish almost before they begin. The call of a bird seems distant, even when it sits above your head. A voice travels only so far before it is caught, absorbed, quieted. And in the centuries of the Little Ice Age, when snow came earlier, stayed longer, and fell heavier, that quiet became a season unto itself. Winter was not just cold, it was silent, and that silence changed everything. It changed how people worked. In open fields, where voices once echoed from row to row, winter labourers found themselves isolated, each shovel of snow, each swing of the axe, a private act. Warnings could not be heard. Songs could not be carried. Even the sound of a blade striking wood seemed to die a few feet away. It changed how people prayed. Church bells once heard across valleys were muffled by snow-drenched roofs and frozen air. In some towns, bells were rung more often in winter, not just for worship, but as a signal, "We are here, we are alive." The sound became a reassurance, not a summons. And it changed how people sang, because voices, like flames, had to be protected. In the cold, breath crystallized, vocal cords stiffened. A single night spent shouting into wind could mean days of hoarseness, or worse, a cough that never left. So singing moved indoors. Choirs huddled in cloisters. Family songs were whispered beside stoves. Lullabies were spoken more than sung. Music adapted to the cold. Instruments warped. Strings snapped in dry air. Wood split in frost. The gut used for violin strings shrank, tightened, refused to hold tune. Pianos cracked. Flutes froze to lips. The musician became not just a performer, but a caretaker, heating reeds, oiling necks, wrapping bodies in cloth. Some instruments simply vanished from use in winter. Others evolved. The hurdy-gurdy, a crank-turned string instrument could be played with gloves. The bagpipe held warmth within its bag. The jaw harp required only a mouth and metal. These sounds became winter's voice, nasal, droning, rhythmic. And rhythms changed. Faster in summer, when fingers were nimble. Slower in winter, when each motion was laboured. Melodies adapted, becoming more repetitive, more chant-like, less for beauty, more for memory. Because in the dark months, when parchment was scarce and ink froze in wells, memory was everything. Songs were passed by ear, not written, not preserved, survived, and survival shaped their content. Winter songs were not cheerful. They were warnings, records, reminders. A verse might describe the frost that killed last year's barley. A chorus might name the 3 children lost to cold. A lullaby might recount the hunger moon of 1647, when even the dogs were eaten. But in these songs, there was also defiance. They did not beg the cold to leave. They dared it to try again. In the Norse tradition, winter songs included challenges to the wind. In Poland, a carol known as Kolenda dla śniegu was sung not to celebrate, but to shame the snow into melting. In France, peasants danced to La Danse du Froid, the cold dance not to warm themselves, but to mock the chill. Sound, when it could not be preserved, became performance. It existed only as long as the breath that carried it, and that breath, in winter, was visible. When people spoke outdoors, they could see their words leave their mouths tiny clouds, evaporating in seconds. Children played games pretending to catch the breath of a song. Lovers measured promises in steam. "I'll stay," someone might say, "until my last breath fogs the window." And so the world became quieter but more intimate. A whisper meant more, because it required closeness, and closeness was rare in a frozen world. The silence was not emptiness, it was invitation. To gather, to huddle, to listen. Inside the homes, the silence was different. It was not the vast, eerie hush of a snow-covered valley. It was soft, breathy. The crackle of wood in a stove, the creak of a chair as someone leaned forward to listen, the sound of soup being stirred, quiet but rhythmic, the gentle rustle of a wool sleeve against skin. These became the soundtrack of winter, and into that quiet, voices entered carefully. Storytelling, once a pastime of the firelit summer courtyard, became essential because stories filled the spaces where noise once lived. Where the market cries used to ring, now came a whispered tale of a lost traveller guided home by a flame. Where children once shouted in the yard, now they sat beneath blankets, wide-eyed, hearing about wolves that turned to men or trees that sang in spring. The cold amplified the emotional weight of the spoken word, because each syllable was a gift, because breath was limited, because no one wasted words when the cost of speech was so high. And so even the simplest song carried weight. Consider the lullaby. It was often the only music heard for days. Mothers and grandmothers sang them slowly, like the fire's own rhythm, each note low, each word clear. These were not songs of joy, they were songs of endurance. Examples still survive in rural dialects. A lullaby from northern Italy, translated, "Sleep, my bird, the wind is still. Sleep, my seed, beneath the hill." A Breton mother might hum, "No moon tonight, no star to see, but Mama's arms are light for thee." And in Russia, the winter cradle songs included warnings. "Sleep, my cub, the wolves are near. If you wake, they'll smell your fear." But there was comfort in the truth. These weren't sanitized songs. They spoke of cold and danger, because the world was cold and dangerous. They prepared children, not to be afraid, but to endure. Winter's silence also changed prayer. In the great stone churches where echo once reigned, frost dulled even the loudest chant. Parishioners pressed closer together. Hymns were sung slower, more solemnly. Choirs were smaller. Organs often froze. Candles hissed against the draught. Faith was no longer loud. It was whispered. A breath against a cold column. A finger traced over a wooden cross, a muttered plea over a sick child, the words barely rising above the crackle of a frozen log. And because voices failed, bells took their place. Not just the great bronze ones above cathedrals, but small ones, worn on belts, tied to doors, hung around goats' necks. In a muted world, the chime became communication. A single bell from the barn might mean a birth. A double chime from the window might signal a lost traveller. Even sleds were outfitted with bells, not for decoration, but for survival. A jingle in the distance meant someone was near, that you were not alone. In some communities, entire festivals were devoted to sound. The silent feast in Bavaria was held not in quiet, but in deliberate sound. Each guest brought one object to make noise: a drum, a whistle, a cracked pot. At midnight, they played them all at once to remind the darkness that voices still lived inside it. It was chaotic. It was joyful. It was noise as resistance. Because the silence of winter could feel like suffocation. And sometimes a clatter was the only answer. Even the animals adjusted. Cattle lowed softly in the barn, not wanting to waste heat. Dogs barked less. Birds ceased their calls. Some creatures hibernated not just to save energy, but to avoid the strain of making sound in a dead world. And people noticed. They began listening more to the wind, to the roof, to the cracking of ice. A father might say, "The snow is wet today. I heard it crunch shallow." A hunter might whisper, "No birds this morning. The foxes must be near." Sound became a kind of reading, a sense, an art, because when you live in quiet for long enough, every creak is a sentence, every rustle a paragraph, every hush a chapter. And winter? Winter was a whole book of silence, one that everyone learned to read. And then, slowly, the world began to warm. Not suddenly, not everywhere, but gradually, like the lifting of a heavy curtain. Snow came later, melted sooner. The rivers sang louder, the birds returned earlier, the bells rang clearer across open valleys, and into that expanding space, sound began to stretch its limbs again. People spoke with more ease. Songs grew bolder. Instruments returned to their rightful place in the center of the home. The violin reappeared. The flute again danced with fingers ungloved. The piano keys were struck not with fear of fracture, but with confidence. But the memory of silence remained. It lingered in the slow tempo of certain folk songs, in the hush before a hymn began, in the stories passed down that still began with the words, "Long ago in the season of snow." Silence had become part of culture, not absence, but shape, a frame around the voice, a pause that gave meaning to words. Even in cities that never slept, where factory whistles and horses' hooves filled the air, the idea of winter quiet held on like frost in shaded corners. In rural places, the quiet was revered. Some communities built listening halls rooms not for music but for stillness. People sat and listened to wind, to wood creaking, to the breath of the person beside them. No speech, no song, just presence. And even the instruments remembered. Musicians still tuned slowly in winter, still warmed their hands before they played, still chose lower registers in colder rooms. The music adapted to memory, because the silence of snow had taught them something, that not all sound is heard, that some songs are made of breath and body and waiting, that the absence of noise can be music too. In time, composers paid homage to winter's hush. Sibelius, in Finland, wrote symphonies heavy with silence, long, drawn-out notes, followed by pauses that chilled more than any chord. In Austria, villagers maintained the tradition of frost caroling, singing just one line of a song at a time, then waiting for the echo to return before continuing. In Iceland, the poem Ljóð í snjó, verse in snow, is read not aloud but silently in communal rooms, each person reading their own stanza at the same time, but without speaking. A chorus of silence, a concert of breath. Even now, when headphones and speakers fill our lives, there is a quiet we crave. We light candles, we sit in snow, we hush rooms before weddings, before funerals, before birth, because silence is not void. It is the shape that holds our sound, and in the centuries of the Little Ice Age, people learned to live within that shape, to speak carefully, to sing softly, to listen fully, and perhaps most importantly, to leave room for the crackling of wood, room for the creak of ice, room for the small, steady voice that says, "I am still here," even when the world is frozen, even when the wind has taken the birds, even when the night has swallowed the sun. I am still here, and I will wait for spring, because even the silence of snow is not forever. It is only a pause, and within that pause we find the courage to whisper once more,